What are the fastest growing churches in America? And what are they doing to grow? This week we talked to editor of Outreach Magazine, Jim Long, about their newest issue on the fastest growing churches in America. It's all in episode 25 of the Church Leaders Podcast.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping you lead better every day. And now here's your host, podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, Andrew Hess.
Well, thanks for tuning in to episode 25 of the Church Leaders Podcast. This week, I'm here with executive editor of ChurchLeaders.com, Brian Orm. And Brian, you've had the opportunity to work with the Outreach 100 issue of the Outreach Magazine in the past. Why do you think that this issue is so important for ministry leaders?
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, it's great to be here and to talk about this issue. And I look forward to our conversation with Jim coming up as well, too. But I think this issue of the magazine, it's our marquee issue, but it's so critical because the research that's being done behind this issue is, I think it stands alone. And for someone, a pastor in ministry, to pick this issue up, they're going to get a broad, sweeping narrative of what God is doing in the church today. And they're going to find great stories of life transformation, stories of how churches tried something unique that worked, that God kind of breathed into it. And the issue is really about life change, about people coming to know Jesus. So I know it's easy to get kind of caught up in the metrics and the numbers, but what we've really tried to push through the years is that the numbers represent stories, and we want to tell these stories so that more and more churches are passionate about outreach.
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation and helpful to pastors both of churches both large and small. Insights for every pastor, regardless of the context. So let's go ahead and roll that conversation that we had with Jim Long. Well, Jim, Brian, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you on the Church Leaders Podcast to talk about the Outreach 100 Fastest Growing Churches edition. Jim, tell us about, kind of give us a little history of the Outreach 100. How did this start, and how did you guys put it together this year?
Well, very early in the history of the magazine, we identified a need and an interest in the church to take a closer look at the churches that are largest and fastest growing, influential churches. We also spent some time looking into churches that seem to be more innovative and kind of setting the pace. So very early in the magazine's history, about 13 years ago, we started doing this. Now it's evolved a little bit over the years, and the emphasis that we're placing now is on trying to identify the fastest growing churches in America and what are the factors that are making those churches thrive.
That's awesome. Hey, Jim, what kind of stats and format do you guys put those together, just to dig a little deeper so people will know kind of the data method behind the magazine and behind the numbers?
For quite a while now, we've been working with Lifeway Research, Ed Stetzer and his team, as our research partners. So each year we contact about, over 70,000 churches and invite them to participate in a self-reported study. So what they're doing then is they're looking at their average attendance for February and March, excluding Easter, and that's compared with the averages for the previous year. We, through Lifeway Research, then we double-check those figures, confirm them with the church, and then we take an average of numerical growth and percentage growth to determine the ultimate rankings. I think it's kind of interesting this year, for instance, if you just total up the fastest growing churches and look at their attendance this year compared to their attendance last year, they report 73,715 people added to the church. If you average the percentage growth of those fastest growing churches, you come up with a rather surprising figure of 24% growth. And that's because there are a few churches on the list that have just had phenomenal off-the-charts growth, which kind of skews that percentage number. But it's a remarkable thing, because you can look at 73,715 and say, well, who are these people? And, your inner cynic may say, well, those are people who move from one church to another. It's just transfer growth. And that does account for a certain amount of it. But these are churches, by and large, that are really focused externally. They're churches that are looking for ways to engage the community, to elevate what's happening in, various types of ministry to the poor, various outreach ministries, as well as evangelistic ministries. So if you take these 100 churches as just a sample and look at it and say, well, now, how much of this is transfer growth? How much of it is just really solid, adding new people to the kingdom? I think that there's some surprising things. So one of the things we've tried to do is look at it and say, well, we don't just want this to be a celebration of numbers. We want to help readers understand and churches really grasp the idea that the numbers are important because every one of those numbers represents a person with a story, a person who's on the receiving end of the love of God. And that's why it's been a really exciting process to follow up beyond just gathering data and stats and start interviewing these churches, doing profiles. Why is the church growing? What are some of the unusual ministries that are happening here? And that's really the heart and the passion that drives the project.
And that's good because there has been, I know, some criticism in the past, like is this breeding comparison or, pushing pastors to be prideful about their growth and their numbers. And so as people have kind of come to you and said, brought that criticism, how have you responded to them?
Well, first of all, this particular study exists because we're trying to make a contribution to the church as a whole. We understand at the same time it may not make sense for everybody. So we're not sneaking around, peeking through windows and counting heads. We're inviting people to participate in a study if it's something that they feel is beneficial to them and to the broader church. That's why if you look at the list, you may go, wait a minute, there's such and such a church I don't see on that list, and I know, well, it's because it's a self-reported survey. And so this is really a representation of the church as those people, the church leaders see it. We try to, confirm the numbers as much as we can and so forth. But it's very much a voluntary thing, and we understand there are some churches that for one reason or another it may not make sense. And if doing some survey and trying to coerce somebody's involvement in it contributes to prideful feelings on their part, that's not really something that we're interested in encouraging. On the other hand, you go to Scripture and you see some really key moments in the ministry of Christ or throughout the Old Testament where you're conscious somebody was counting heads. So there's a value to the numbers, especially if we're looking beyond that and looking at the stories they represent and then looking for trends. What are the transferable concepts? What's working in one city that might work in another city?
Yeah, I love that. And Jim, I've always appreciated the passion that Outreach Magazine has had specifically for promoting the stories and making it about what God is doing and less about, like you said, the comparison. And the data that's received, I think it's a really helpful collection of what God is doing and has done in the past through history within the American church. So I think there's a ton of value to it. And I've been at conferences as well, too, where I've seen people hold up the Outreach 100 list and kind of use it as kind of a launching pad to talk about how we shouldn't count or even to talk about it in a valuable way. So I know it's had some controversy, but I think as you explain it, too, and we've talked about it in the past a lot, too, that there's a lot of value for these stories. And so the stories or the numbers are a launching pad. And I love that about Outreach Magazine for sure.
Yeah, and I think that as we look at the numbers, we can try and isolate trends, see things that are happening. For instance, in this special issue, the Outreach 100 American Megachurch Annual, there's an article in there, just a brief 2-page piece by Warren Bird at Leadership Network, and he's answering the question, is the era of the megachurch over? Because we hear that sometimes, and we kind of carry around certain assumptions about what's happening with large churches. Read that article and you find that his conclusion is the numbers say, well, no. But, there are a lot of things that we gather as we begin to build a profile of the American evangelical church, particularly the outreach-oriented churches in the country, that without having some sense of where we've been and where we're going, it becomes a little more difficult to draw valid conclusions, to look at trends and so forth. And I think that's one of the really positive things that has come out of this project, so that it doesn't just become, oh, well, here's a sheet, what are your bragging rights, here are mine. But instead, we begin to see certain trends. For instance, an emerging trend that Ed Stetzer points out in his introductory piece to their research is gigachurches, so-called churches of 10,000 and more, that are becoming more consciously multicultural. And the question he asked is, well, how does that happen? It's not something that just naturally happens. It requires a degree of intentionality. And yet when it does happen, when a church becomes truly reflective of its community, that's not just making it more effective in reaching certain people that, are pulled into the gravitational pull of what God's doing at that church, but it's also a witness to the broader community that the kingdom of God is not just about a particular group of people who share certain demographic characteristics. But the kingdom of God is much more broad and comprehensive than that. And I think it's quite interesting. This year, the number one fastest growing churches is one of those churches that made a conscious decision. We're going to do what it takes to be more effective in reaching all segments of our community.
Yeah, I love that. And just real briefly, can you share with us the number one fastest growing church?
Number one fastest growing church is Crossroads, where Brian Tome is pastor in Cincinnati. And it's interesting, if you just take a closer look at that church, here's a church, their attendance average for this year is 22,738. A year ago, 17,064. So here's a church that grew by 5,674 over the previous year. That's 33% growth. This is a church that's been around since 95. And, we hear sometimes about churches or organizations or companies having kind of natural life cycles, and we hear about the importance of kind of reinventing yourself. Churches do this too, right? I mean, they periodically sit down and say, well, now, why are we here? What are we doing? How could we more effectively reach our community? And it's really heartening to see that kind of thing happen. And something else that I noticed in the interviews and the profiles that we did with that church, we also, by the way, sent a mystery visitor. This is a regular column in the magazine where an unchurched person pays a visit to a church and, kind of records their reaction to that experience. It was so interesting to me to see it was just an off-the-charts positive response. And here's why. One of the things they've said is that we seek to strip away religion and rules and give people relevant truths to their lives, and we have a lot of fun while we're doing it. And it's interesting. I've gone through, if you compare the fastest growing church list with the largest list, and look at the overlap, you're still looking at 167 distinct churches. I've read through in the past few weeks, all of those websites, their About Us section where they're describing themselves. We've done interviews and profiles with about 30 of them, plus some of them that we've interviewed in the past, done a profile of in the past few years. And I was kind of looking, what are some of the commonalities in the way some of these churches are describing themselves? And this sense of, I want us as a church to strip away every obstacle, all the preconceived notions of what it means to be Christian or to be religious. Let's get back to a pure presentation of the gospel relevant to this culture. And when that happens, I suppose it's not surprising that it becomes a place that maybe is a bit more winsome or has at least raises a curiosity, in the watching community, because all of a sudden you can't just say, well, Christians, I know what Christians are. I picked that up on the news. I know how they think and what they feel, and I wouldn't fit in there. But I'm surprised the number of churches, and you can tell some of them, by the way, have been to the same seminars because they use some of the same terminology. We'll do everything short of sin, to reach people outside the church. You have to appreciate that passion that animates a good number of these churches.
Yeah. Now that's a huge takeaway, I think. And I see it in the leadership movement too. There's a vulnerability movement going on, an authentic movement that's happening. And it's really fascinating to see that sliding into church growth and the churches that are experiencing that kind of forward momentum too. So fantastic stuff. One quick question. I know Andrew's got another one coming up too, but let me ask this: as a small church, like many of our listeners and many of our readers, you may come from small churches. What is the advantage for a small church pastor to pick up the Outreach 100 issue?
Great question. And let me respond in two ways. First of all, at Outreach Magazine, we're really cognizant of the amazing things God is doing in smaller congregations. And that's why several years ago, to, in a sense, sort of counterbalance the Outreach 100 megachurch issue, we started doing the Small Church America issue. And that runs in July, August. And it's an exciting thing to realize that there are remarkably innovative ministries happening in smaller congregations, that there's a certain mojo, to that small, more intimate gathering that larger churches are trying to recapture. The emergence of, smaller groups and really building ministry around it is partly in response to that concern of that sort of sense of lost intimacy and in how a larger gathering can become impersonal. But specifically to your question, I think that it's interesting that if I am a megachurch pastor and I pick up the Small Church America issue and I don't come away with a lot of ideas and transferable concepts and innovations coming out of Small Church America, I've probably not read it very carefully. And conversely, there are a number of things, emerging trends in larger congregations that filter down to smaller churches. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of our readership, which, the majority of whom are in smaller churches, a lot of them pick up this issue and really kind of make a study of it because they realize that certain trends larger churches are kind of on the forefront of, but are more broadly adapted over time in the church. Example, video venues. Isn't it interesting that there are a lot of small churches now that are merging with other churches because of the whole concept of, satellite campuses and so forth? So a smaller church may be in a community and they're even limited in their growth just by the population. A number of those churches are now either partnering with churches in other communities, or there has been a merger, or a church may be dying in one community and another church comes alongside and helps breathe new life into that. So, that's one transferable concept that you see developed in larger churches and expressed also in smaller churches across the country. Some of them quite small, and yet they're experiencing remarkable growth for the size of their community.
And it does seem that even the larger churches are doing these things that you've mentioned to make sure that people are in smaller communities.
That's right.
So even in the midst of a large church, you have, the microsites or online, different ways that people are staying connected to a smaller community. And I think Willow Creek was the one that kind of spearheaded that, where it's like, we can't let people get lost in the crowd. And so talk about how some of these larger churches are doing that to make sure that people still have small communities, even in the midst of a large church.
Well, and it differs, of course, from church to church. For a number of years, my wife and I were part of North Coast Church out in the San Diego area. It's interesting because it's been somewhat influential on the issue of small groups, with hovering around 90% of regular church adult attendees involved in a small group. And in that case, it started with a realization we can maybe get people coming to one service, 1 hour a week, so to say, maybe a second hour. If we can only get people twice a week, what's that second thing we want them involved in? Now, volleyball's fine, and softball, and a lot of other, target type activities and ministries. Those are fine, but if you're really going to throw the church's resources behind that 1 other hour you think you can get people, that staff sat down and said, well, we want that to be in smaller groups, accountability groups. They also kind of had the question at one point, do we want to be the church everyone wants to go to, or do we want to be the church no one wants to leave? It's a very different way of thinking about the proposition of growth. So, all this talk about closing the back door and, nailing the windows shut or whatever.
Boarding it up.
Boarding it up. In their case, they realized that the preaching can be good, the music can be great, But that's not really what hooks people in, gets them involved, makes them feel a sense of ownership, sharing the vision and the passion of the church. That happens in the context of community. And community is rather difficult to make happen in multiples of 1,000. It can very effectively happen in living room groups. So a lot of churches, I think, have kind of adapted that principle of the priority of where we put our resources and our time. And it's been a remarkable thing to observe just how much stronger that emphasis is, and the awareness that it's not enough. There's nothing wrong with being an attractional church, but it's not enough just to attract people. We all have the question of, okay, how do we retain people? How do we engage people? How do we get people to share the heartbeat of this ministry? And that requires tighter, closer relationships.
Well, Jim, you've had such a neat opportunity to look at some of these churches that are growing so quickly, and it's exciting to see what the Lord is doing. As you look at this issue and kind of the different trends that you've seen, what are some of the key takeaways that our listeners can learn from this issue and from the research that you guys have put together?
It puts us in a unique situation because we're putting together and releasing an issue each year that's really related to a fairly narrow metric. How does worship attendance this year compare to worship attendance last year? But there are a few churches that have elected not to participate in this study because it isn't statistical enough. And so there are churches that are measuring far more. Traditionally it's how many people are sitting in the seats and how much are we getting out of their wallet, But beyond dollars and attendance, nickels and noses, I think that there's a real desire to get a better sense of the progression individuals are making in their own faith journey. So some churches are measuring the faithfulness of their volunteer group. There have been several efforts at putting together some sort of measurement and online tools for personal growth. It may not give an accurate measure of exactly where you are between you and God. That's kind of difficult to reduce to statistical analysis. Sure. But on the other hand, you may be able to plot whether you're progressing or not progressing. Anyway, I think that's some of what we're seeing. So I think there continues to be value in just looking at the numbers, the attendance numbers, but it's really driving our editorial agenda, the realization that that's not an adequate measure. You're not a successful church just because you get more people. You can pervert the gospel and get more people because you're saying what people want to hear, not necessarily what they need. There are various ways to build numbers, but we're all concerned about how are we building the kingdom. So we're looking at the Outreach 100 American megachurch issue as kind of a way to leverage those deeper questions. We'll continue to help churches measure their attendance, but we really want to get beyond what are some of the trends that are happening and what are churches doing to foster a greater sense of discipleship and movement toward a deeper understanding of what faith demands of us.
How do you kind of take what you're learning there and kind of look to the future and kind of what do you see as the future of larger churches or kind of some of these faster growing congregations?
Well, there's a lot of people a lot more intelligent on this issue or any issue and a lot closer to it. I will say that some of the things that we are hearing from people who are students of it is the era of the megachurch is not over. There are those who feel, it wasn't that many years ago that we thought 2000 was this huge church, and we kind of imagine there are certain plateaus that churches probably would not grow beyond. And yet now there are a number of churches, 10,000 or larger. I thought it was interesting in the in-depth interview with Brian Tome. He kind of feels that over the next decade, there'll be a number of churches in this country that are larger than 100,000. And as he looks at it, and I've heard this from others too, there's a sense that there's a certain consolidation happening. And, I think we went through a period of time where we were so concerned about, kind of creeping theological liberalism, and that's still a concern, the purity of the gospel, huge concern. But the emphasis is slightly different. Don't you sense that there are churches looking for other churches to partner with who share that kind of commitment to the historical truth of the gospel, and yet are looking for ways to bridge barriers, to come alongside one another and do something more effective for the kingdom together than they could apart? And so that kind of era where maybe we were more characterized by our separatism from one another is giving way perhaps to a sense of, yes, let's be really, really clear on the essentials of the gospel, but let's look for affiliations and partnerships. Let's understand that the essentials are essential and the non-essentials shouldn't be the things that divide us. And so I think that whole spirit of we can do more effective outreach together than independent of one another is a unique thing happening in our time that we should really be excited about. I think that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and that is exciting, and it reminds me of Jesus' own prayer in John 17,
yes.
That the church be united. And I think there have been times where we kind of look at the church across town and think, oh, that's them. They're doing it their way and we're doing it our way. But now we're seeing that those walls are kind of falling, and it's like, let's work together. Like we're all under the headship of Christ and working on the same team. So Jim, Brian, thanks so much for being with us. Great conversation on what God is doing as he grows his church. And we're so thankful. Again, this is all of this is reason to be grateful to God for the way that he is working. So if you would like to get this issue or get the list, you can go to outreach100.com. And thanks again, guys, for being here.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Great to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, thanks again to Jim Long for joining us this week as our special guest on the Church Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a few minutes to subscribe, rate, and review us in iTunes. Make sure to download the show notes for this episode at churchleaders.com/podcast. The show notes always include resources mentioned in the show and some of the links to our guests' top content on churchleaders.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website, churchleaders.com. Thanks for listening.